To hear this and many more audiobooks not available on YouTube in a podcast feed, please visit the first link in the description below, and thank you for your support. America Against America by Wang Huning. Chapter 5. Interwoven Political Forces. Part 1. Donkey and elephant rule the country. The donkey is the symbol of the Democratic Party and the elephant is the symbol of the Republican Party. Some people have imaginatively described the election campaign in the United States as the battle of the donkey and the elephant. In fact, both parties represent the ruling class of society and control politics, so it can also be said that the donkey and the elephant rule the country. When analyzing the U.S. elections, it is important to understand the pivotal position of both parties. It is impossible to understand American politics and how it is run without understanding bipartisan politics. American politics is run by both parties, but neither party is really a political party, just an aggregated mass. Compared to most Western and Eastern political parties, they are an even rabble. We can look at why American political parties are rather like a rabble. For one thing, neither party has a set system of membership, some registration procedures. In fact, they don't have members in the strict sense of the word, and voters can self-identify with whichever party they want. Voters can self-identify with whichever party they vote for in the election. No one recognizes them as party members, and they don't need to be recognized to say, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat. Even senior party leaders probably had no concept of party membership from the beginning. The doors of both parties were wide open and access was free, like a temple. Second, neither party has a systematic theory, and there are differences between the two parties on many issues. But there are also various views among the two parties, from the left to the right, and from the center, etc. Among the members of both parties, all ideas can be heard. Senators or representatives nominated and elected by both parties are also free to decide what to do, and can even oppose their own party's proposals. Third, neither party has a complete platform, and if you want to find a copy of the Democratic or Republican Party platform, you will never find one. Political parties generally have only two kinds of documents that indicate their positions and propositions. One is the platform formed at the nominating convention, but it cannot bind anyone. The other is the president's speech about it. So neither party can tell people clearly what they really want. They only propose some reform ideas on domestic and foreign affairs at election time, not their basic lines. Fourth, neither party has a tight organization, and it is rare to hear which party holds branch or membership meetings in general. American political parties are electoral parties. That is, they are active only at election time. And it is not clear who is a member of the party itself during weekdays. It is like a person who is in a market and does not know what he or she should do until then. The federal system, too, prevents both parties from becoming well-organized parties. Each state has its own independent power, and the boundaries between the federal and state parties are well understood, with each state actually having its own Democratic and Republican parties. What the local party organizations do at election time is not known to the national organization. Regardless of this, what people are talking about is whether or not a candidate with their party's logo can be elected. This shows that the concept of two parties is very different from that of a normal political party, but such loose organizations should not be underestimated. Sometimes their strength lies in such looseness. Of course, it is not that the two parties are not organized, it is just that these organizations are not very effective outside of elections. There are two types of political party organizations in the United States, one permanent and one ad hoc. The lowest level is called a precinct committee, which usually has only one person in charge. At the same level are town committees and other committees. At the top is the county commission, whose committee is made up of precinct members usually, with the county commission being the more important layer. Between the county and state committees there is a congressional district committee that puts forward candidates for Congress. Further up the ladder is the state committee, because state legislation varies from state to state. The mechanism for creating state committees varies greatly and is not uniform. The state committee is the permanent body of the party in the state and is responsible for promoting the party and consolidating it. The chairman of the committee is a prominent figure in politics. Finally, there is the National Committee. The National Committee is composed of representatives from each state. The National Committee is loose, has little power, and cannot do much. Both parties do not have a formal central committee or standing committee, and there is no concept of a U.S. standing committee. The chairman of the National Committee is responsible for leading the campaign headquarters, promoting the candidates, fundraising, and other matters, and has little power but only a steward role. In addition to this, both parties will have headquarters for election services, from national headquarters, state headquarters, to county headquarters. It may seem that the two parties still have a more decent top-down or bottom-up organization, but in reality, there is very little connection between the organizations because there is no theory, no party platform, no fixed membership, and no idea how to connect. There was some connection between the National Committee and the state committees, and little connection further down. The national headquarters also had no control over the local headquarters, which went about their business under the banner of the national headquarters. Because the main goal of the local headquarters is to win elections, there are no other benefits to be gained, such as a bigger share of the house, buying some cheap goods, and riding in a nice little car. The people who come to work understand what they are doing before they come, so it works fine. As long as you can win the election, you can use whatever tricks you have. The National Committee doesn't bother to control either. The two parties are the most willing to have others fight under their banner. You can do whatever you want as long as you play under my banner and negotiate certain terms. National franchise stores, such as McDonald's, Hardee's, and Kentucky Fried Chicken, are available nationwide. The head office has no idea what they are doing other than selling the same goods. Americans implement the same idea in politics and economics. The two parties are like a national franchise, with each branch doing its own thing to sell its products. In fact, there are not only the two parties, there are also many small parties, such as the Socialist Workers' Party, the American Party, the People's Party, the Communist Party of America, etc. But they have never become a major party that can compete with the Republican and Democratic parties. One of the important reasons is that the two parties do not have clear boundaries, including a lot of dissidents. There is no need for them to take refuge in others or occupy the top of the mountain because they are excluded. It is sometimes unbelievable that two major parties that can dominate politics are so loosely organized. In fact, the energy of the two parties lies in the looseness. For one thing, it's hard for American culture to accept a well-organized political party and to understand a party platform that is ready to be used for 20 years. Americans are pragmatic, and it's not even that easy for them to come up with the idea. They want to solve the specific problems they encounter in society. The individualism that people are raised with makes it difficult for them to become so deeply involved in a political organization that they can disregard their own interests. People choose political parties for their own benefit. Second, both parties are open doors. Anyone can enter and exit. The grassroots party members cannot talk about discipline. The U.S. political parties are an ugly hodgepodge, well known for their inclusiveness. In fact, this is an important condition for the long-term existence of the two parties. The two parties have no mechanism to exclude those who are willing to support them, but have a mechanism to absorb different people. Because there are no clear boundaries, anyone who wants to can come in, and anyone who wants to can go out, and there is no real point in opposing them. The general public can only be uproarious. The main power of the party was in the hands of a small group of party leaders, unavailable to the general public. Third, both parties are electoral parties whose main purpose is to win elections and do not have a fixed political goal. They do whatever will help them win the election. This mechanism motivates them to cater to voters' aspirations as much as possible and to unite themselves with their voters. The policy ideas that both parties talk about actually summarize voters' problems and then propose solutions. This ability to adapt is also important for both parties to maintain their position. In this process, party leaders add the idea of representing the interests of big money and specific classes to the mix. Of course, after winning an election, they may disregard all their campaign promises and do something else. Voters have little control at this point. Part 2. Political party fertilization. The political party fertilization system, in theory, is already very limited. Since the introduction of the civil service in the late 19th century, public sector officials and employees have been divided into two categories, one elected and the other permanent civil service, with most officials coming from the latter system. They are selected through an open and competitive mechanism. See Chapter 7, Selecting Officials. Independent of whether a party wins or loses an election, and do not work with the party in practice. However, the party that wins the election is still very well off, and the system of fat sharing still exists among political officials, and not in small numbers. According to the New York Times, the number of presidential appointees of all kinds, full-time or part-time, substantive or honorary, adds up to about 8,000. The article estimates that there are around 2 million federal officials. Some estimates are much higher, so 8,000 seems like an insignificant number, but it is not. These 8,000 positions are all important positions, the status is important, and there is a lot of money involved. Once a political party wins, it gets a piece of meat, and those who have made meritorious achievements in the election are rewarded with a title and a salary. Soon after Bush was elected as the 41st president, Reagan asked all such officials to resign in general so that the president-elect could organize a new team. Why is this a fat piece of meat? Let's look at what is included in this meat. 14 cabinet ministers, with an annual salary of $99,800. Their deputies earn between $75,500 and $89,500 per year. 134 ambassadors abroad, with an annual salary of $75,500. Head of the various control committees with an annual salary of $82,500. White House attorney and physician at $89,500 per year. And so on. 8,000 positions is a lot of money. When you compare the salaries of university professors, you can get an idea. Very famous professors, especially those in science and medicine, can earn upwards of $200,000 per year, while professors in the liberal arts generally earn less, with full professors earning $40,000 to $60,000, associate professors less than $40,000, and assistant professors even less, despite having a doctorate. Naturally, not all of the 8,000 people have such high salaries. Some also don't bother with politics because these salaries can be pathetically small compared to the corporate world. Chrysler Motors general manager Iacocca's annual salary in 1987 was $7 million. One professor commented, "No one is worth that much." Public sector salaries are relatively lower than those of the corporate world, but these positions have the additional attribute of political significance, the right to rule. After winning the presidential election, the political parties have to consider how to divide the fat. This is a sensitive and complex project. On the one hand, it is necessary to satisfy all those who have contributed in the election, and on the other hand, it is necessary to form an effective team. If the same party is re-elected, this also involves how to treat the existing team. Let's take a look at the two key figures Bush has already chosen. Secretary of State James Baker, 58, is a lawyer in Houston. He was chairman of all 4 Bush campaigns and made his mark. He was Reagan's chief of staff and served as the Secretary of the Treasury. Close to Bush, can be said to be the most beloved family friend. Chief of Staff John Sununu, 49, governor of New Hampshire and a doctor of engineering from MIT, is credited with saving Bush in the New Hampshire primary. Bush was nearly defeated by another Republican candidate, Dole, and Sununu as governor fired up the machine and saved Bush's life. Bush chose him as chief of staff, replacing incumbent chief of staff Craig Fuller. Fuller had been Bush's chief of staff since 1985 and was loyal, but Sununu was simply too meritorious for Bush to pass up. Bush keeps announcing his choices and appointments. Before the election, the rich contribute money, the powerful contribute, and after the election is won, you can pop the crown and get an official position for all those who have merit. The winner is the king, the loser is the enemy. The defeated party candidates in the election and many campaign assistants have to look at these fat vacancies. This process is not without checks and balances, because it is a fat job, and in a society like the United States, a mechanism is bound to develop. Of the official positions that the president can appoint, 700 require Senate confirmation, such as ambassadors and the like. The White House team and the advisory team do not need to be approved by the Senate. This mechanism controls the president's appointment power and makes him consider the feasibility of appointing some officials. In theory, the U.S. officer system has significantly weakened the party fattening system, but the party fattening system still exists in practice. This mechanism is not only found in the presidential elections, but also in the elections of congressmen and senators. If you are elected elected to the House of Representatives or the Senate, you can organize a team, and the people who have helped the politician get ahead in the election will be rewarded. This is the official position. Official positions imply power, and power implies decision-making. These important official positions often have the power to determine the direction of government finances, and far more people than just the official appointees may benefit from a party's electoral victory. In addition, once you are in high office, you have a secure future. If the party loses the next election, or is itself dismissed or wants to leave, major companies or institutions will be eager to hire them at high salaries. Many former key government officials are now working for major companies. They have been in the White House or Washington and are an important resource. The question is, what role has this system played in the management of society? Why has this part of the political party fattening system been preserved? One of the main reasons for changing the party fattening system in the late 19th century was that it led to selfishness, inefficiency, corruption, and at the same time led to an unstable system of governance for the whole society. Every official was appointed and might have to walk in the next term, so they had to grab a tight buck. Because government officials change in a whirlwind pattern, government management is not consistent and coherent, but the fat-sharing system at the top is still preserved. The fat-sharing system ensures that the elected political party builds an effective team, although there are various drawbacks in it. However, from the management point of view, the president appoints friends and relatives of the same party to hold each key point of the political system, which is easy to form a highly integrated and convenient political chain of command. This system can do all kinds of things, good and bad, but from the political command without such a system will be difficult to move forward. Imagine the president does not have the power to organize the team. All the members of the team have to be decided by others. How can the whole government function? It will certainly form mutual constraints and conflicts. The reason why it has been preserved is that it is necessary for social management and political rule. Anyone elected to the presidency would want to hold such power, so it has not been changed. Second, this power is unrestricted to a certain extent, and the president can use it to his heart's content. But, at the same time, there are limits. The House and Senate of Congress have some oversight of government officials, including the president himself. Nixon had to resign because of the Watergate scandal. Many administrators have had to resign in the course of their administration. The biggest constraint is the quadrennial presidential election. After a new president is elected, especially if a candidate from the other party is elected, all appointed officials have to be reappointed, or if they are not appointed, they are free to go. Generally speaking, when the other party's candidate is in the White House, all the appointees will have to roll up and move out. A team that fails to win hearts and minds and loses elections loses office. Despite this or that limitation, once elected president, you can share the fat with your party and form a one-party dictatorship in the federal government. In fact, the federal government is also a one-party dictatorship, except that it is subject to the test of elections, time constraints, and the constraints of Congress. The successor is king. The loser is the enemy. In American politics, this is the unbreakable truth. Third, while the implementation of the fat-sharing system is beneficial to the winning party, it also poses a challenge to those who enjoy fat jobs. If the party loses, they will have to lose their posts. And then, where will they find a job? There is no such problem for officials, as they can retire to their homes, but not for political officials who will have to prepare for their future if the wind changes. Senior government officials naturally do not have too many problems, but many lower-level government officials have such problems. It should be said that the social mechanism of the United States has created certain conditions for the implementation of the fat-sharing system without which the fat-sharing system could not be realized. Where does a person who is a minister or the head of a department go when he suddenly has no job? American society is a society where everyone has to go to work and no one arranges jobs. This mechanism, which constantly consists of private companies and departments, is also practiced by schools and other sectors. If one is highly competitive, one can find a job. People who have held senior positions in Washington have a stronger competitive edge than the average person, some of whom originally had their own businesses, and some of whom returned to their former workplaces. Society provides the mechanism to absorb these people so that it does not constitute a serious social problem. Administrative officials are first prepared for this mentality when they become officials. Preparing to say goodbye to Washington after a few years, they have long started looking for a way out. There is no tenure system for government officials, and those who wish to do so will take the bait. Otherwise, every government has to change shifts, and so many important people, wouldn't it constitute a major social problem? There are disadvantages to political party fertilization. The question is how to find mechanisms to monitor and control them. At the same time, not any society can implement this system. It depends on whether the social environment has the corresponding mechanism. The political parties are fattened, to a large extent, to guarantee the unity and efficiency of the administrative team and the unity of step within the ruling class group, which is a basic mechanism. Part 3. Interest groups. Interest groups, also known as pressure groups, are an important phenomenon in American politics and society. Understanding interest groups and pressure groups is not only an important part of understanding American politics, it is also an important part of understanding the processes that run American society. What is a pressure group? In general, it is a group that wants to use common power to influence the political process. This group often has its own special interests, and they exert influence on the political process to protect their own interests or to get a greater benefit. Only a small number of interest groups are idealistic. The basic driving force behind the activities of interest groups is self-interest. The decisions of the political system largely influence the pattern of social interests and the distribution of social benefits. Anyone who wants to protect or expand his or her interests should influence political decisions first. Herein lies the basis of interest group activity. Interest groups are also considered to be the basis of pluralism. Politics is pluralistic when interest groups can influence the decision-making process. If there is no force in society that can influence the governmental decision-making process, politics is monistic. There are various means by which interest groups can influence the political process, of which lobbying is the basic means. Many of the active lobbyists in Washington are representatives of interest groups. Interest groups are one of the characteristics of capitalist societies, and also of some developing countries. Interest groups often play some peculiar roles, linking politics and economics. In a capitalist system, the government does not directly manage the economy. Conflicting economic interests are ostensibly coordinated by government policies and laws. Various interest groups influence the formulation of policies and laws through their own activities so that they reflect their own interests to the greatest extent possible. This process, in fact, links economic groups to political groups, or rather, links a portion of economic groups to political groups. Other types of groups can act in the same way. Interest groups are an inevitable product of capitalism. Under the condition of private ownership of property, individual interests are clear and well defined, and the drive and mechanism to pursue greater interests are strong and powerful, so it is natural for individual interests to converge into group interests for greater power. Interest groups are of various types: economic, linguistic, cultural, religious, ethnic, professional, and so on. One of the characteristics of the capitalist system is that the government is passive. Traditionally, the smallest government is the best government, and in order to use government to protect and expand one's interests, it is obvious that individual power will not work. Only group power will work. There is a tradition and culture of forming groups in order to make a difference, which is a characteristic of its social organization. According to some scholars, 6 out of 10 American adults are affiliated with an organization. There are political and non-political interest groups. Political ones include Republican and Democratic clubs, political activist groups, and so on. Other interest groups are as diverse as school service organizations, youth organizations, veterans organizations, farmers organizations, ethnic organizations, church organizations, fraternal organizations, professional organizations, labor organizations, and sports organizations. They are all independent mass organizations that do not have a leadership relationship with the government and therefore have to find ways to influence the political process. The top interest groups are business, labor, and farmers organizations. Business organizations have a lot of money and can hire specialized people to lobby on their behalf to influence the political process, such as the National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Unions have extraordinary power because they have a large membership and a large number of people. Different interest groups have different levels of influence. Naturally, the smaller interest groups are not comparable to the larger ones. What really works, or often works, are the large interest groups, and the small interest groups have freedom of action, but are often not very effective. That said, a society's political process cannot have everyone plugged in, and in that case it would lose its unity. The natural evolution of such a system results in large interest groups with economic as well as political power. This inequality of interest groups can be seen in the means by which interest groups influence the political process. All interest groups do not have the power to walk into the office of the president or the office of a member of Congress and order them to do something. They must influence them to achieve such ends. First, they must have the financial resources to support the people who work exclusively for the interest groups, which are the lobbyists, and who operate at the federal, state, and local levels of government. Secondly, they need to have members, and it is obvious that only a dozen people with 7 or 8 guns can't make things happen. However, there is a view that because of the nature of public good and free ride open door, large groups are not as organized and effective as small and medium-sized groups. The third requires expertise, a system in which no one can speak for themselves in adopting policies and laws that benefit a particular interest group. They must be legislated and voted on, which requires interest groups to use reasonable, sufficient, and scientific means. There are naturally dirty deals to be made, but subject to the exclusion of the political process, each interest group monitors how the others operate, and in this situation, the interest groups must have specialized, systematic knowledge about them and use them to achieve their ends. The fourth is to have access. There are people who are good officials, and there is a big difference between knowing and not knowing. From these conditions, large-scale interest groups are naturally much more lively and powerful. So, if American politics is pluralistic, it is not pluralistic in this area. This is something that must be noted when studying American politics. Large or powerful interest groups often have real power in their hands, which is a condition for their formation and existence. Some call such interest groups quasi-governments. They can control the practice of certain professions, which are mainly limited to professional organizations. They can set standards and rules. They can also allocate public funds, and many kinds of funds provided by the government are eventually distributed by private groups, despite the rules set by the government, but the county officials are often less effective. The private groups responsible for such matters are naturally superior. They have great power to influence the economy or a sector of the economy. This makes the government think twice before interfering, and so on. There are various reasons for the creation of interest groups. The privatization of the economy is also the basis for the creation of interest groups. The capitalist mode of production requires the government not to interfere in the economic process, to obtain cooperation and guide the economy, or to regulate the economy and other social activities. The government cannot have wishful thinking and must take the major interest groups seriously. Conversely, the interest groups, coordinated by law and policy, must operate legally and must also look at the face of the government. This mechanism of interaction is one of the features of the social, political, and regulatory process. As for the interaction of interest groups, it can be said that they infuse various demands into the political system and play a communicative role, serving to connect the political system to society at large. It can also be said that interest groups represent the interests of a segment of the population, and that no powerful masses without power can form a powerful interest group. Both of these phenomena exist. From the perspective of social management, the former function exists objectively, although many interest groups do not subjectively have such an agenda. But the latter phenomenon is one of the problems in social management. If well-organized, well-resourced interest groups are best able to influence the political process, then who represents the interests of the common people? Is American democracy democratic enough? It is possible to put a question mark. The existence of interest groups, as I have already analyzed, is an inevitable product of the American social system, political system, and culture. In this triple structure, it is impossible to identify other ways to harmonize politics and society. The question is, at which point the inherent weaknesses and strengths of this mechanism become so out of balance that a crisis arises. In social management and political processes, the existence of groups to collect, synthesize, summarize, and channel society's interest demands is an important condition for political systems to be able to satisfy the greatest interest demands. Each political system has limited resources and can often satisfy only a portion of the interest requirements. The best policy is not the one that satisfies all of society's interests, which is impossible, but the one that satisfies the greatest number of interests with the same resources. To do this, the political system must try to understand, through various channels, the various interests that exist in society. Part 4. Lay Advocates. Lay advocates is my translation of the word lobbyist, phonetically and paraphrased. Many people translate it as corridor counselors or lobbyist. Lobbyists are a very important phenomenon in American political life, and one cannot ignore this important area in understanding American politics. What does lobby mean, and who is a lobbyist? According to Karen Sagstetter's book, Lobbyists are people who specialize in persuading people and who work with members of local councils as well as state and federal legislatures and agencies. They try to influence government policy and legislation, and they represent special private or public interest groups. They lobby everywhere to get the government or the legislature to do something or not to do something. There is nothing derogatory or dishonorable about the concept of lobbyists, and it is not sneaky or unseen. The lobbyists, all of them, were visible, even powerful. Frank Cummings wrote a book called Capitol Hill Manual. In this book, the author sagely teaches congressmen that although many historical stories contain the implication that lobbying is a dirty word, there is no sin here. It is essential. Cummings reasoned that no representative or senator can be an expert on any issue, and that even the experts in Congress cannot know everything about everything, nor can legislators know what a particular group thinks about particular issues. So, from the perspective of legislation and governance of society, the function of a lobbyist is really one of providing information and expression of interests. Of course, all lay advocates have intentions, and most of them are not arguing for the general interest, but for a particular interest. If the argument is successful, often a special interest group can benefit from it. Let's take an example, hypothetical. Chinese textiles are low cost and sell for $50 per suit, while American labor is expensive and costly and sells for $100 per suit. So, consumers will choose Chinese suits. This makes it impossible for American manufacturers to make a profit. So, the U.S. textile industry's lobbyists will lobby in Congress to pass legislation that either raises taxes or restricts imports. If Congress passes the legislation, then this interest group will gain significantly. There are all kinds of lobbyists of all shapes and sizes. Some of them work for private groups, and there are many of them. Some of them work for social organizations, such as labor unions, environmental organizations, and public welfare organizations. There are also many foreign governments who want to benefit from congressional legislation or make money from it, so they hire lobbyists to serve them. For example, in 1969 to 1970, South Korea sent a large number of people to operate in Washington for 7 months in order to obtain $50 million in additional aid. Some of them negotiated with the President of the United States, who had to get the support of Congress because of the separation of powers in the United States. Most of the President's lobbyists are executive advisors under the President, and sometimes they form a council to deal with Congress. There are many names for the President's council, but the basic function is the same: to influence the legislative activities of the legislature or the decisions of the executive branch. Lobbyists use all kinds of means to carry out their activities. They have to meet with the legislators, to prepare documents, or to have lunch. The job of a lobbyist is not so easy. To become one, you have to have certain requirements. The main tasks of a lobbyist include 1. Research, detailed study of a particular issue and a particular bill. 2. Testifying at hearings. 3. Working with legislators, drafting speeches, preparing reports, drafting bills, answering letters, etc. In addition to direct lobbying, there are other tactics, such as grassroots lobbying, which starts with influencing voters in the legislature's own constituency, cross-lobbying, where several different interest groups work together with the debaters to publish voting records, put pressure on legislatures through ballot records or public opinion, and so on. On the other side of the coin, legislators also need lobbyists. They need to know the information and materials necessary to express their opinion on a bill. That's why legislators often do not sit and wait for the lobbyists to come to them, but go to them on their own initiative. Of course, there are different attitudes towards lobbyists, some against them, some for them. One thing is certain, and that is that every lobbyist has his or her own goal. They always have their own intentions when it comes to facilitating the legislators. That is why the Capitol Hill Handbook says, "There is danger here." The normalization of the activities of the lobbyists was reflected in a certain degree of institutionalization. In 1946, the main statute regulating the activities of lobbyists was passed in the United States. Everyone who wanted to influence the legislative process had to register if they were paid to do so. In this way, individuals, associations, and companies all fall under this scope. When registering, it is necessary to state the scope and field of activity, name, address of the company, name of the employer, number of years as a debater, salary, who pays the salary and daily expenses, which legislation is of interest, who receives funds, and for what purpose. In terms of the law, it is naturally good, but it's actually extremely flawed. Many people influence the legislative process, but they can claim they are not lobbyists and have no interest in the legislative process. In total, there are about 20,000 lobbyists working in Washington. The activities of the lobbyists are often effective and significant. Israel, for example, has a very strong and effective platform. There are approximately 6 million Jews in the United States, and they have an above-average level of education, social status, and political activity. One of their major lobbyist organizations, AIPAC, had 75 members and a budget of $5.7 million in 1985. Naturally, Arab lobbyist organizations are also very strong. The book Washington Lobby gives a number of examples of the effectiveness of lobbyists' activities. Needless to say, few ordinary people have their own lobbyists. One of the characteristics of American society is that the political arena has been turned into a big commodity market, and politics has become a kind of trading market like the economic market. You can sell your own products or buy other people's products in it. Politicians bargain in it. You compete with each other. This process is regulated by law, but the first law recognizes this political model, which has both advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that in political competition it is generally easier to sell quality products, which forces those who want to compete to come up with good products. On the other hand, large companies can monopolize the market, promote their own products, or promote inferior products and obtain monopoly profits. Although the political arena is not easily monopolized by anyone, the wealthy and powerful groups naturally have the advantage. This political spirit is a very important component of American political culture, and in fact is susceptible to the spirit of its highly developed commodity economy. The requirements of the commodity economy are to find the best patrons in the market, to market products, to obtain the best technology, the best conditions, and to obtain the maximum benefit. This principle connects the lobbyists with the legislators and government officials. They are always in the position of sellers or buyers. Another cultural factor reflected in this is the secularization of politics. There is a problem of secularization of religion, and there is also a problem of secularization of politics. People engage in politics like anything else, such as doing business, scientific research, making money, etc. There is little sense that politics has a special status. Politics becomes an ordinary everyday matter, and although the political power is held by the upper echelons of society, they have to be secularized to do politics. Otherwise it won't work. Part 5. Radical Organizations. Passing through the city center, there was a girl who had a bookstall in a busy place. Not many people patronized it. I happened to be walking by and took a look at the books she was selling, and was intrigued. The books on the stall included the Communist Manifesto, a collection of Castro's speeches, and a collection of Trotsky's speeches. It was easy to see that she belonged to a leftist radical organization. It is said that there are hundreds of such small organizations, or micro-organizations, in the United States. They are active, but have little political influence, and most of the population does not care about them. The girl was also selling their organization's newspaper, The Militant, with the following headline: "A weekly socialist news magazine, published for the benefit of the workers." The Militant was a 16-page newspaper, like the Shanghai newspaper, Shinmin Evening News, and sold for $1 a copy, which was more expensive than the average newspaper. Browsing through The Militant, one can see a bit of interesting and thought-provoking news. The largest amount of space was devoted to the defense of a man named Mark Curtis. This man was an active member of the organization and was accused of sexual assault. The story is that on March 4th, 1988, the girl who identified him, Morris, was at home watching television when, after about 8 p.m., someone called for her parents, and she said they were not home. 10 minutes later, there was a knock on the door, and when she opened it, the man sexually assaulted her and beat her. The Militant published the activities of Curtis that night to prove that Curtis did not have time for this, and the newspaper called for public solidarity with Curtis. Also in the news, criticism of Prime Minister Thatcher. for expelling the Cuban ambassador to the UK and the third secretary of the Cuban embassy. Oscar Fernandez Mel, the Cuban ambassador to Britain, was one of the founders of the Cuban Communist Party and was elected to the first Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party and had assisted Zaire's anti-imperialist struggle together with Che Guevara. The girl who sold newspapers once said that Cuba was the only socialist country left in the world, I'm afraid. There was a large report on political movements in Burma. One reported on a rally of 250 people in Zimbabwe to discuss Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution, and an article on the experience of the Pennsylvania miners' strike. An article worth mentioning, so that one can probably grasp the basic idea of this radical organization, is titled One Caribbean, One Destiny, and is about a conference held in New York. The subject of the conference was the prospects of the anti-imperialist struggle. The conference was organized by the Caribbean Unity Coalition. This organization consisted of 38 political organizations from 23 countries. The main speaker was the press secretary of the former Prime Minister of Grenada. His statement is worth reading. He said, quote, "What we are going to discuss is the use of our coalition against theirs. Our coalition, meaning the coalition of workers, farmers, fishermen, young people, students, people who are suffering. Their coalition refers to people with power, privilege, capital, and wealth." End quote. In today's world, there are still many who speak such words. Many participants condemned the U.S. intervention in Cuba and Nicaragua, saying it was aggression and a major obstacle to human beings getting housing, education, bread, and other basic necessities of life. More interestingly, the newspapers also carried notices of this party, the Socialist Workers' Party, running in the 1988 presidential election. The presidential candidate was Warren. The vice presidential candidate was Michels, and there was a campaign committee. Such a candidate would naturally not get much traction and would probably be completely drowned out in the noisy campaign of Bush and Dukakis. The newspaper The Militant called for popular subscriptions, advertising that The Militant tells the truth and reports the facts and the truth about the war waged by the United States against the peoples of the world, and that if the truth were obtained only by major mass communication, we would be ignorant of the war waged by the United States against the peoples of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. As you can see from the above reports, this is a radical group, and there are countless such radical groups in the U.S. and other Western societies, but most of them have little impact. Some of the issues that these organizations talk about are true, and some of their ideas are not unhelpful to social progress. The status of these self-proclaimed socialist organizations is particularly low in the United States. I am afraid that these phenomena cannot be seen in the context of the programs and activities of these organizations, but in fact reflect the relationship between the two major ideologies in the world today. Since the post-war socialist countries have encountered twists and turns of one kind or another, their economic development has lagged far behind that of the capitalist countries, so their overall appeal is not sufficient. The economic development of the capitalist countries, on the other hand, has produced an overwhelming appeal. Generally speaking, the public does not judge the merits of society from the point of view of institutions, structures, ideas, spirituality, human nature, etc., but from their own daily life, or from the gut, not from the brain. Because of the huge gap in economic and social development, organizations and ideas that advocate reforming the capitalist system will have no great impact in Western society. Therefore, American society also leaves them to their own devices. If one day the economic level between the East and the West is reversed, I am afraid that they will have to be regulated. In fact, we won't have to develop beyond them, just pull even, and the ideological battle may rise again. A friend says that this is a good point, and that with a few more serious recessions, there will be a market for radicals. Part 6. Diversity or Excellence. There are a number of people who view the United States as a pluralist society and portray the American political system as pluralistic. An early proponent of this argument was David Truman, who portrayed the basic mechanisms of pluralist politics in his book, The Process of Government. The second was Robert Dahl, who depicted the basic mechanisms of the contemporary American political process in his book, Who Rules? I have translated Dahl's modern political analysis and understand his ideas better. His concept, strictly speaking, is polyarchism, not pluralism. Yet whatever the conceptual differences, their basic idea is the same. In American society, power is shared, with many competing interests striving for power, in which no single interest can monopolize power and no one part of the population is completely excluded from it. Power is shared among different social groups through such mechanisms. It is evident that pluralism is to be based on interest group theory. The basic thesis of pluralism is that different social groups can influence the processes of power. The question is whether there is such a possibility, and pluralism advocates argue that there is. For one thing, the United States is a country of immigrants, and the society is full of various ethnic, linguistic, and religious groups, and differences between different industries still exist clearly. In other words, the United States is a melting pot society, as Nesbitt said. Secondly, it is true that Americans have a natural tendency to form groups to pursue their own interests. There are many different kinds of groups, because the government is less control, the better. So you want someone to control some things, either by organizing yourself or by organizing to influence the government. The electoral system also facilitates this mechanism. And the American experience in the election is that a certain number of people can constitute a certain force. Third, the separation of powers structure of the government also lays the foundation for pluralism. The separation of powers prevents any government department from holding sole power, so power in the United States is contested by a variety of competing forces. Various interest groups in society share power through competition, negotiation, and compromise. The government is the regulator, and the government has its own special interests. The other group rejects the idea of pluralist politics and believes that American society is a democracy of excellence. Most people do not enjoy political power. It is mainly the large organized groups that can compete, and it is difficult to say what role the small groups have. Large groups have far more power than small groups, and the people involved in the groups do not include all the people in the field. Groups have a certain tendency to have interests. In addition, the most powerful government is not at the mercy of the government. It can use its power powerfully to pursue its own policies and achieve its own intentions. The elitists believe that the public elected representatives and interest groups have no power. Power is in the hands of a small group of power elites. Among those who advocate this idea are Grant McConnell, who wrote a book called Private Power and American Democracy, 1970. Theodore Lowy, The End of Liberalism, 1969. C. Wright Mills, and Ralph Miliband, Power Excellence, 1956. Ralph Miliband, The State in a Capitalist Society, 1969, and others. Mills, with some authority, says that the power elites command the major hierarchical structures and organizations of modern society. They run the state apparatus, lead military organizations, and occupy strategic command positions in the social structure. He argued that power in American society comes from three main sources: large corporations, military organizations, and political leaders. The U.S. economy was in the hands of hundreds of large corporations, which determined the socio-economic direction of society. Political power was increasingly concentrated in the federal government, with the president's powers expanding. The military has become the government's largest spender and largest institution. The leaders of these three spheres constitute the class of power elites who decide issues of life and death. The public can only look to power and do nothing. Not only that, but Mills also sees these three areas of power as interconnected and complementary. A retired general is hired as a manager in a defense plant. An unsuccessful presidential candidate goes to work as a consultant for a major corporation. The chairman or manager of a major corporation becomes a government official. Thomas R. Dye has a book called Who Rules America, in which the notion is that America is ruled by 5,000 moguls. Another book by Thomas Dye, also interesting, is called The Irony of Democracy, an uncommon introduction to American politics. His main point is to assert that American society is ruled by excellence. He says that America has been ruled by brilliance since its founding and continues to be ruled by brilliance to this day. The result of the rule of genius is the alienation of the people, the power of genius and the protest of society, which constitute the dilemma of American politics. The meaning of democracy is rule by the people, for the people, and of the people, but the actual operation of politics is the inevitable rule of genius. The so-called rule of genius means that power is wielded by a small group of people. Therefore, the management of society in the end is in the hands of a part of the brilliant, regardless of whether this number is 5,000 or 50,000. They are definitely the minority of society. The rule of geniuses is a common feature of societies under the capitalist system. This therefore raises a question for the development of human society, whether democracy in the strict sense of the word is in accordance with the laws of development or the inherent requirements of large-scale human society. While Americans theoretically defend institutional and constitutional democracy, they also psychologically and culturally worship excellence. There are few peoples who worship excellence as Americans do. While it may seem that many Americans are unconcerned about many things, the hero worship mentality is actually very strong in American culture. This may have something to do with American history and national upbringing. This mentality and cultural values are the basis for the rule of excellence that prevails in America. Americans, conceptually, advocate popular democracy and practically accept the rule of excellence. See Chapter 3, Section 4, Sanctification. This is both a peculiar and an unspeakable aspect of the American social system, and many scholars have recognized that the phenomenon of rule by excellence is contrary to the principles of popular democracy. But it is produced by popular democracy, and some people take advantage of it, and cannot be forced to abolish and restrict it, which in turn undermines the principle of democracy. This dilemma will be broken in the future operation of the American social system, but in which direction it will go cannot be predicted yet. Part 7. Participation in democracy. In recent years, a number of scholars have been talking about the latest development in capitalist republics, participatory democracy, as the democracy of the 21st century. Alvin Toffler's The Third Wave and John Naisbitt's Megatrends are the best examples of this theory, asserting that participatory democracy is causing revolutionary change. Harland Cleveland, director of the Hubert Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, writes that participatory democracy may be the newest definition of democracy in the information society. The form of organization of power in the United States is typical of republicanism. The establishment of the American Democratic Republic was a product of historical movements, and its formation was historically caused by the rapid development of capitalism in the 13 colonies at that time. Soon after the establishment of the 13 colonies, a free capitalist economy emerged, and the most developed industries at that time were the woolen and metallurgical industries, which could even compete with the British mainland. The economic and political restrictions imposed on the colonies by the British ruling class led to the intensification of conflicts between the 13 colonies and their rulers. The 13 colonies strongly demanded the establishment of their own regime to protect and promote the development of the colonial capitalist economy, thus giving rise to the historical demand for the establishment of a democratic republic in politics. The establishment of the capitalist economy in the 13 colonies meant that commodity production and commodity exchange achieved dominance, and from commodity production and commodity exchange inevitably comes the demand for a democratic republic, which is due to the fact that the entity of commodity value is undifferentiated abstract labor, and with this qualitative equivalence, commodities can be exchanged with commodities. Commodities are exchanged in equal amounts according to their value, and the socially necessary labor time which determines the value is calculated spontaneously by the society under the conditions of normal production, average proficiency, average labor intensity, etc. These conditions themselves imply equality, meaning that there is no distinction between high and low producers of commodities. The democratic republic is the political institutionalization and legalization of the economic principle that commodities are inherently equal. In the past 2 decades, with the development of social productivity, science, and technology, and social contradictions, some new phenomena have emerged in democratic republics. Citizens' participation in political decision-making or legislative activities abound, and democratic forms have developed dramatically in depth and breadth. Some scholars believe that the political system and political institutions of the industrial age have become obsolete and weak, and has now entered the stage of participatory democracy or semi-direct democracy. In The Third Wave, Toffler asserts that the third wave poses a revolutionary challenge to the outdated institutions of the second wave, and that this challenge cannot be met simply by changing regulations, for it strikes at the most basic conception of second wave political theory, the idea of representative government. Naisbitt asserts that the United States has undergone a shift from representative democracy to participatory democracy. American scholars have written about participatory democracy in a variety of ways, summarized in the following 3 areas. First, The actual holder of state power, i.e., the executive head, should be directly elected by the widest possible range of people. The so-called direct election is relative to the previous indirect election. For example, some scholars argue that the popular election of the president is a transition from the electoral college system to a de facto direct election in which the presidential electors are virtually null and void and even the political parties are dispensable. Second, the broad participation of all citizens and local states and towns in political decision-making or legislative activity is even more important than the previous one. The founding principles of the United States placed great emphasis on the emancipation of the individual, including freedom of speech and keeping government influence over the individual to a minimum. However, the implementation of this principle was greatly compromised by limitations in communication and other equipment. Now, with advanced communication devices, citizens are free to participate in political decisions or legislation and can even stay at home and push buttons to express their will. The electronic city government in Columbus, Ohio is a prime example of how political issues can be discussed through a television system. Nesbitt uses the data to demonstrate that the 1970s were the height of creation and referendum in the United States, which leads to the inference that most of the laws in the United States are now made directly by citizens or by the states. Third, because of the first two items, the logical consequence is the tendency to decentralize politics. Since citizens are free to participate in political decisions and legislation and to solve their own problems, it does not matter who is president, and citizens and states do not care who is elected to Congress. They no longer need representatives. But for now, we are still electing representatives for two main reasons. A, we have always done it that way before, and B, it is politically easier to do so. We don't want to vote on whatever it is. We only want to vote on those things that really affect our lives. Thus, centralization of power no longer works, and centralized democracy has become decentralized democracy. Participatory democracy has indeed expanded formal democracy, but it has also strengthened de facto centralization. This is an intricate process of movement in which the forces of action and reaction interact. With the major breakthroughs and wide application of science and technology, especially electronics, information, energy, and computers, production has developed rapidly, and it has led to a further democratization of the management of the production process, and a further centralization of the management of people. The decentralization of shares and the increase of small and medium-sized enterprises have played a very important role in this change. Shares in contemporary U.S. corporations are extremely fragmented, with a large corporation often having thousands or tens of thousands of shareholders. Workers also hold a certain number of shares. Although the number of shares owned by workers is quite small, they more or less become one of the owners of the enterprise, and so these shareholders also demand the right to participate in corporate decisions. Moreover, since the monopoly profits of a monopoly capitalist enterprise cannot originate from itself, it needs to keep the small and medium-sized enterprises that can provide it with monopoly profits. The more the monopoly grows, the more the number of small and medium-sized enterprises grows. The participation of these small and medium-sized enterprises in the management of the economy on a social scale makes it possible to increase their activities in favor of their own development. Under these conditions, the principle of equality in the production of goods developed into a concept with democracy at its core. This concept requires a socio-political system that is formally compatible with it. This requirement is first of all expressed in the democratization of the management of public affairs. Social public affairs are closely related to social production. The content and scale of contemporary public affairs are constantly expanded and changing, and it has a very important role in the development of production. It can hinder as well as protect and promote the development of production. For this reason, people from all walks of life or small and medium-sized enterprises involved in economic management are bound to demand participation in the management of public affairs in the sphere of the superstructure, so that it will be beneficial to the development of their respective production. However, the workers' shares have no decisive power over the enterprise, and these funds of theirs are precisely controlled by the large shareholders. Due to the extreme fragmentation of shares, big capital can now control even millions of small shares of the whole enterprise with 2 or 3%. In this way, big capital invariably moves social capital, bringing their concentration to a higher degree. Likewise, since SMEs exist only as suckers for profits. Their various efforts to participate in decision-making in public affairs while contributing to their own development are expanding the sources of profits and promoting the concentration of capitalist production. This inevitably leads to a situation of formal democracy and substantive centralization. The corollary of this situation is that formally, people enjoy more democratic rights and can participate in the production process and in the management of public affairs, but substantively, all their democratic activities can only be carried out consciously in accordance with the requirements of the further concentration of capital, and their actions are unified under one will. Marcuse, of the Frankfurt School, analyzed the economic and political structure of American society and came up with a thoughtful observation. Quote, "The space of the private has been violated and reduced by the realities of the technological world. Mass production and mass distribution demand total appropriation of the individual." End quote. This process inevitably spills over into the political process, giving rise to a high degree of political unity that no skilled craftsman or orchestra conductor could have imagined. Naisbitt identifies the guiding principle of participatory democracy as the requirement that those whose lives are affected by a decision should be involved in the process of making those decisions, a requirement that we have analyzed for profound economic reasons. However, this participation in democracy is very limited. In his analysis of American politics, Naisbitt first confined it to local politics. The instruments of the new democracy, creation and referendum, were also limited to local affairs and had no role in national activities. In addition, the creation and review of the vote involved only specific social issues, such as the ban on spraying herbicides from airplanes, the creation of non-smoking areas, the recycling of beer bottles, the color of streetlights, and other issues, which were not effective in some substantive matters. In the late 70s, there was a movement to reduce taxes in the United States due to the passage of Proposition 13, a tax cut in California, and each state proposed its own program, but it died down after a year. In fact, political power is increasingly centralized, and modern technological means provide good material conditions for such centralization. Many American thinkers saw this, and even Toffler himself, in his analysis of the third wave, was sensitive to this direction, saying that the first heretical principle of third wave government was minority power, that the extremely important and legitimate principle of the second wave era, namely majority rule, had become increasingly obsolete, and that now it was not the majority that had the say, and that the political system had to reflect this fact more. Look at the American political system. Behind the facade of participatory democracy, the process of centralization is accelerating dramatically. Almost 1 in 6 working Americans is employed by the federal government or its affiliates. In 1976, with more than 15 million federal and local government employees and a payroll of $167 billion, Robert J. Ringer wrote inexorably, quote, "You find the world struggling in the hands of an artificial monster, the government which is growing larger and larger and more uncontrollable. This untamable beast is slowly extending its tentacles into every area of our lives, trampling on human rights as a matter of habit." End quote. Daniel Bell, a distinguished professor at Harvard University, said in 1976 that the central problem in Western political systems is the relationship between the desire for broad participation and bureaucratic politics. This contradiction has now been temporarily resolved under participatory democracy. The state functions by developing one structure, the expansion of formal democratic participation, in order to develop another, the strengthening of rule. This is a more indirect and effective form of rule, which is more in line with the principle of equality in the production of goods. Universal suffrage in modern America has added the elements of creation and referendum, which has partially transformed the form of universal suffrage from an indirect form to a direct form, where some matters previously managed by the elected officials are now directly intervened by universal suffrage. The development of science and technology has also made this formal expansion possible, and these formal changes have not changed the basic character of the American political system. End of Chapter 5.